Welcome to HOA Storytime Central. The string line went up, and so did her voice. The deadline is real, and the consequence is real. That is what Diane Hall shouted at me while I stood in my backyard, holding a post-hole digger, concrete mix already poured into the wheelbarrow, and a contractor waiting beside his truck with the engine running. She screamed that I could either tear it down today or pay daily fines until it disappeared. I looked at the freshly dug hole, then at the string line I had stretched between two survey stakes that morning, then back at Diane. She stood 3 feet inside my property line with a megaphone in one hand and a laminated policy sheet in the other, both arms extended like she was directing traffic at a disaster scene. The megaphone was the same one she used to announce mailbox inspections every third Thursday. The policy sheet had a clear rain cover, but no readable text, just rows of dense print that caught the light. I am a licensed electrician in Portland, Oregon, and I have pulled permits for commercial jobs in 3 states, so I know what a setback is, and I know what a survey looks meant. This fence was legal. Diane did not care. She said, "You do not build to my standard, you pay to my standard," and she said it slowly like she had practiced. I kept my face neutral. The Hillcrest Reserve Association had spent 6 months targeting me over every renovation I tried, and this fence was the last straw. I had bought this house in January to be closer to job sites on the east side, and the first week I moved in, Diane sent a violation notice about my truck being parked in the driveway overnight. The notice claimed commercial vehicles were banned after 7 p.m. I checked the covenants. No such rule. I emailed her. She replied that the rule was in the supplemental guidelines, which were posted on the portal, which I had not been given access to yet, and that my failure to check the portal was not her problem. That set the tone. Every project after that brought a new notice: the color of my trim, the height of my mailbox post, the brand of my porch light, and now this fence. I was trying to refinance, and any lien threat could wreck the deal, so I could not afford to ignore her. The stakes were real, and Diane knew it. The concrete for the posts was already mixed, and if we did not set them now, it was wasted. My contractor, a guy named Luis who had done 3 jobs for me without a single callback, stood by his truck with his arms crossed. He looked at me, then at Diane, then back at me. He said, "I am not starting until this is handled." Diane turned to him and said the HOA would fine him directly if he proceeded, and that she had already notified his business license board. Luis raised his eyebrows. I asked Diane if she had done that in writing. She said, "Go ahead and call whoever you want, I have a committee for that." I nodded like I was losing, because I wanted her to get comfortable. I already had the trump card, I just was not ready to play it yet. The fence itself was a 6-foot cedar privacy fence, replacing a chain-link disaster the previous owner had left. The survey I ordered in March showed my property line running 8 feet inside what Diane claimed was an HOA easement. The surveyor had marked the line with bright orange stakes, and I had photos. Diane insisted the survey was wrong because it did not match the plat map she had printed from the county website in 2003. She waved that printout at me during our first argument about the fence 2 weeks ago, and when I pointed out that my survey was certified and hers was a 22-year-old screenshot, she said certification does not override covenant intent. I asked what covenant intent meant. She said it meant the board knew where the line was and the board did not need a surveyor to tell them. That was when I started recording everything. I asked Diane what specific rule I was violating. She held up the laminated sheet and said Section 12-4-C. I asked her to read it out loud. She said I could read it myself on the portal. I said I did not have portal access yet, and I had been asking for it since February. She said that was not her fault, and that ignorance of policy was not a defense. I pulled out my phone and showed her the email chain where I had requested access 4 times. She glanced at it, then said the portal administrator was on leave and I would have to wait. I said, so how am I supposed to follow rules I cannot see? She said the rules were available at the annual meeting, which had happened in November before I bought the house, and that minutes were posted, and that I should have asked the seller for a copy. The circular logic was perfect. Every path led back to my failure. Luis cleared his throat. He said, if we do not set these posts in the next 20 minutes, the concrete is going to set in the wheelbarrow and I am not mixing another batch for free. Diane turned to him and said then, you better leave, because the HOA is not authorizing this work. Luis looked at me. I looked at Diane. I said, do you have a stop work order in writing? She said, I do not need one. I am communications director and I speak for the board. I said, that is not how it works. She said, it is how it works here. She tapped the laminated sheet with one finger. Then she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen 3 times, and said the tow truck is already on the way. My stomach dropped. I looked at Luis. He said, they are towing my truck? Diane said, no, yours is fine. I am towing his van, and she pointed at my work van parked in the driveway. I said, you cannot tow my van from my own driveway. She said, I can, if it is in violation of parking standards. I said, what parking standards? She said, commercial vehicles over 10,000 pounds. I said, my van is not over 10,000 pounds. She said, prove it. I said, the registration is in the glove box. Do you want to see it? She said, I already called the tow company, and they will verify when they arrive. I realized she was bluffing, but she was also serious. A bluff that produces a real tow truck is not a bluff. I asked her if she had a signed tow authorization. She said the board gave her standing authority for compliance enforcement. I said, show me the vote. She said the vote was in March. I said, I want to see the minutes. She said the minutes are on the portal. We were back to the circle. Luis said, I am leaving. Call me when this is sorted, and he walked to his truck. I did not blame him. Diane smiled. She said, you see, even your contractor knows you are wrong. I did not answer. I was counting seconds in my head, waiting for the tow truck. If it showed up, I would have proof she had called it without proper authority. If it did not show up, she had just lied to me in front of a witness. Either way, I was building the case. The tow truck arrived 6 minutes later. It was a flatbed with yellow strobes and a driver who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He climbed out, glanced at Diane, glanced at me, and said somebody called about a commercial vehicle. Diane pointed at my van. The driver walked over, looked at the van, looked at the plates, and said, this is registered residential. I cannot tow it without a police standby or a signed property owner complaint. Diane said, I am the HOA compliance officer. This is an HOA violation. The driver said, HOA does not override state motor vehicle law. If the owner lives here and the vehicle is registered here, I need a different authorization. Diane insisted the tow is authorized, and the tow driver hesitated. He looked at me. I said, I live here. That is my van. It is under 10,000 pounds, and I did not give consent. The driver nodded and said, I am not taking it. Diane said, I will file a complaint with your company. The driver said, go ahead, and he climbed back into the truck and left. Diane stood in my driveway, breathing hard, holding the megaphone like a weapon. She said, this is not over. I said, I know. She said the board is meeting Monday and you are going to be fined for every day this fence is up without approval. I said I submitted the approval request 8 weeks ago. She said you submitted an incomplete request. I said what was missing. She said the materials disclosure form. I said I included that. She said you did not use the correct version. I said there is more than one version? She said the updated form went live in April. I said you never told me. She said it was posted. I said where? She said the portal. We were spinning again. If you are enjoying this, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos. I went inside, pulled up my email, and found the thread where I had submitted my fence application. I had included the survey, the materials list, the setback measurements, and the contractor license. I had also included a PDF labeled materials disclosure form, dated March, which I had downloaded from the county clerk site because the HOA portal still did not exist for me. I forwarded the entire thread to my real estate attorney with a note that said, "This is escalating. I need a consult." She replied in 40 minutes. She said if they fine you without a hearing, that is a violation of Oregon statute. She also said the tow attempt might be tortious interference, but we would need proof she acted without authority. I told her I had the tow driver on video saying he would not take the van without proper authorization. She said perfect, keep recording everything. Then she said, if they try to put a lien on the property, we can fight it, but it will delay your refinance and cost you time. That was the leverage Diane had, and she knew it. Monday came. I showed up at the board meeting with a folder full of printouts, the survey, the original application, the email thread, the contractor license, the tow driver video transcript, and a printed copy of Oregon Revised Statutes 94.630, which required HOAs to give written notice and a hearing before imposing fine. Nez over $50. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a beige room with folding tables and a projector that nobody ever used. Diane sat at the front table with 2 other board members, both of whom looked uncomfortable. One was a retired accountant named Paul, who had never said a word to me. The other was a woman named Sandra, who ran the neighborhood garden committee and always smiled when I drove past. Diane had a stack of papers in front of her, and the laminated policy sheet propped up like a menu. There were 4 other homeowners in the room, including my ally, a calm guy named Ben, who lived 2 streets over and had been fighting the HOA over a deck permit for 6 months. He had brought a printed copy of the actual covenants, the ones filed with the county in 1998, and he had highlighted every section that contradicted the rules Diane kept citing. When the meeting started, Diane announced that I was on the agenda under new fines. She said I had installed a fence without approval and that the fine was $100 per day starting the day I set the first post. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I stood up. She said, "You are not recognized." I said, "Oregon law requires a hearing before you impose a fine over $50, and I am requesting that hearing right now." Paul looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at Diane. Diane said, "We are conducting the hearing now." I said I was not notified. She said, "You are here, that is notification." Ben stood up and said that is not how it works. You have to give written notice at least 5 days before a hearing. Diane said Ben was out of order. Ben said he was reading from the covenants, and he held up the printed booklet. He read the section out loud. It said any fine over $25 required advance written notice and an opportunity to respond. Diane said that section was superseded by the updated procedures. Ben said, "Show me the vote." Diane said it was in the minutes. Ben said the minutes from the last 6 meetings are not posted. Diane said that is because the secretary resigned. Sandra raised her hand and said, "Can we just pause and figure out what the process is supposed to be?" Paul nodded. Diane said the process is that I enforce compliance and the board ratifies it. Sandra said, "I do not think that is right." Diane said, "Are you questioning my authority?" Sandra said, "I am questioning the procedure." The room got quiet. I saw my opening. I said I have proof that Diane called a tow truck on my van without board authorization and that she threatened my contractor with a business license complaint that she never filed. I pulled out the printed screenshot of the tow driver video and the email thread showing no complaint had been logged with the state. Diane said that is irrelevant. I said it is not irrelevant, it shows a pattern of claiming authority she does not have. Paul asked to see the video transcript. I handed it to him. He read it. He looked at Diane. He said, "Did you call a tow company?" Diane said I was enforcing parking rules. Paul said, "But did the board authorize that?" Diane did not answer. Ben said, "I have a question." He looked at Diane. He said, "You keep citing section 12-4-C. Can you show us that section in the covenants?" Diane said it is in the supplemental handbook. Ben said the supplemental handbook is not legally binding unless it was approved by a membership vote. Diane said it was approved. Ben said when. Diane said 2019. Ben said, "Show me the vote record." Diane said, "It is in the archives." Ben said, "I checked the archives last week. There is no record of a vote on any supplemental handbook in 2019 or any other year." Sandra said, "Is that true?" Diane said Ben does not have access to the full archives. Ben said I requested access under Oregon Public Records law, and the management company gave me everything they had. He pulled out another folder. He said this is every board vote from 2015 to now. There is no supplemental handbook vote. Diane stood up. She said this meeting is over. Paul said we have not voted on anything yet. Diane said I am adjourning the meeting. Paul said you cannot adjourn without a motion. Diane picked up her megaphone and her laminated sheet and walked out. Sandra looked at me. She said I am sorry. I said it is not your fault. Paul said we need to get a new management company. Ben said we need to get a new board president first. Sandra said Diane is not board president, she is communications director. Ben said exactly, and she has been acting like she runs the whole association. Paul said I am going to call an emergency meeting. Sandra said good. I said I need this fine rescinded in writing. Paul nodded. He said I will send you an email tonight. He did. The email said the board had voted to rescind the fine and to pause all enforcement actions pending a full review of procedures. It also said Diane had been asked to step back from day-to-day compliance duties. I forwarded the email to my attorney. She said congratulations, but watch for retaliation. I said I am already watching. The next morning I found a new violation notice taped to my front door. It said my fence was installed in an HOA easement and that I had 14 days to remove it or the HOA would remove it at my expense. The notice was signed by Diane, dated the same day as the board meeting, and had a handwritten note at the bottom that said you were warned. I called my attorney. She said this is retaliation, file a complaint with the state. I said where? She said the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services. They handle HOA disputes. I said, will that stop her? She said, it will put her on notice, and if she continues, you will have grounds for an injunction. I said, how long does that take? She said weeks, maybe months. I said I do not have months. She said then we escalate now. She drafted a state procedure complaint that forces the HOA to respond and sent it to me for review. It cited the tow attempt, the unratified fines, the lack of written notice, and the retaliation notice. It also requested a full accounting of all board votes related to fence rules and enforcement authority. I signed it, and she filed it the same day. Diane found out about the complaint 3 days later. I know because she showed up at my house at 7 in the morning with a man in a Hillcrest Reserve polo shirt and a clipboard. The man introduced himself as Craig, the property manager. He had a forced smile and a voice that sounded like he had practiced staying calm. He said he was here to inspect the fence and verify the easement boundary. I said, "Do you have a survey?" He said he had the plat map. I said the plat map is not accurate. I have a certified survey. He said he would like to see it. I went inside, grabbed the survey, and handed it to him. He looked at it for 30 seconds. He looked at Diane. He said this shows the fence is inside the property line. Diane said the survey is wrong. Craig said surveys do not get certified if they are wrong. Diane said the surveyor did not account for the easement. Craig said, "What easement?" Diane pointed at the laminated sheet. Craig said, "I need to see the recorded easement document." Diane said it is in the covenants. Craig said, "Show me." Diane opened the laminated sheet and pointed at a paragraph. Craig read it. He said this does not describe an easement, this describes a setback. Diane said it is the same thing. Craig said it is not the same thing. I said the survey shows an 8-foot setback from the property line and the fence is 10 feet from the line. Craig nodded. He said then you are compliant. Diane said he is not compliant because he did not get approval. Craig said, did he submit an application? I said yes, 8 weeks ago. Craig looked at Diane. Diane said the application was incomplete. Craig said what was missing? Diane said the materials disclosure form. Craig said, do you have a copy of the form he submitted? Diane said no. Craig said then, how do you know it was incomplete? Diane did not answer. Craig sighed. He said, I am going to recommend the board close this case. Diane said, you do not have that authority. Craig said, I am the property manager. Enforcement recommendations are literally my job. Diane said, the board will override you. Craig said then they can vote on it, but I am not putting my name on a violation notice that contradicts a certified survey. Diane tried one more move. She said, if the board does not act, I will. Craig said, what does that mean? Diane said the covenants allow any board member to take emergency action to protect property values. Craig said that is not in any covenant I have ever seen. Diane said it is implied. Craig said implied does not mean enforceable. He turned to me. He said, I apologize for this. I will send you a formal clearance letter by end of week. Then, he walked back to his truck. Diane stood in my yard, staring at the fence, breathing hard. She said, this is not over. You do not build to my standard. You pay to my standard. I said, you already said that. She said, I mean it. I said, I know you do. That is why I recorded it. I held up my phone. She went pale. She said, you are recording me? I said, I have been recording every interaction since the tow truck. She said that is illegal. I said Oregon is a one-party consent state. She said you are harassing me. I said I am documenting compliance disputes. She said I am calling the police. I said go ahead, I will show them the video of you threatening my contractor. She turned and walked away. I watched her go. Then I called my attorney and told her what had just happened. She laughed. She said, please tell me you actually recorded her saying that. I said I did. She said send it to me. I sent it. She said this is over. They are going to drop the case to avoid a public records mess. The state complaint moved faster than I expected. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the Department of Consumer and Business Services saying they had opened an investigation into the Hillcrest Reserve Association and that the HOA was required to produce all board minutes, enforcement policies, and vote records within 30 days. My attorney said this is good. It means they took your complaint seriously. I said, what happens now? She said the HOA will either settle or fight, and fighting is expensive. I said, what does a settlement look like? She said they drop all fines, issue a formal clearance on the fence, and agree to a no retaliation policy in writing. I said that sounds perfect. She said it is, which is why they might not offer it. I said, what is the alternative? She said they keep fighting and we take them to court. I said, how much does that cost? She said more than the fence. 3 days later, Paul called me. He said the board met in emergency session and voted to settle. He said Diane had been removed as communications director and would not be involved in compliance decisions going forward. He said the board was also hiring a new management company and revising all enforcement procedures. He said the settlement would include a full clearance letter, removal of all fines, and a written agreement that the HOA would not retaliate or relitigate the fence issue. I said, what about Diane? He said, what about her? I said, does she agree to this? He said she was not given a choice. The board voted, and she was outvoted. I said, is she still on the board? He said, for now, but there is a recall petition being circulated. I said, who is circulating it? He said, Ben. I said, good. The settlement letter arrived a week later. It was 3 pages, signed by Paul and Sandra, and countersigned by the new property manager. It said the HOA acknowledged that my fence was compliant with all recorded covenants, that no further approvals were required, and that the association would not impose any fines, liens, or other penalties related to the fence. It also included a no retaliation clause that said any board member or officer who took action against me in connection with the fence dispute would be personally liable. My attorney read it and said this is exactly what we wanted. I said, so it is over? She said, it is over. But it was not over yet. The final showdown happened 2 weeks later at a surveyor truck parked by the boundary while the surveyor explains the line out loud. Diane had demanded a third-party verification of the property line, and the board, exhausted, agreed to pay for it, just to close the matter. The surveyor was a woman named Karen, which I found darkly funny, who arrived with a truck full of equipment and a no-nonsense attitude. She spent 2 hours measuring, taking photos, and reviewing the recorded plat. Diane stood in the yard the entire time, arms crossed, occasionally asking questions that the surveyor answered in flat tones. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching. Ben showed up halfway through and stood beside me. He said, this is the best thing I have seen all year. I said, it is pretty good. He said, I cannot believe she is making them pay for this. I said, she has to. It is the only move she has left. The surveyor finished and walked over to Diane. She said, your property line is exactly where the previous survey indicated. Diane said that is not possible. The surveyor said, I just measured it 3 times with a laser level and a GPS unit. It is possible. Diane said the easement changes the line. The surveyor said there is no recorded easement on this parcel. Diane said check again. The surveyor said I do not need to check again. I pulled the title records this morning. If there was an easement, it would be recorded. Diane said the HOA has an easement. The surveyor said then the HOA needs to record it, because right now it does not exist. Diane turned and looked at me. I raised my coffee mug in a tiny salute. She turned back to the surveyor and said, "I want a copy of your report." The surveyor said, "I will send it to the HOA and the homeowner." Diane said, "I want it now." The surveyor said, "I do not carry printed copies. You will get it by email." Diane said, "This is unacceptable." The surveyor said, "You are welcome to hire your own surveyor, but I guarantee they will get the same result." Then she packed up her equipment and left. That night, I got an email from Paul. It said the survey confirmed the fence was compliant and that the board was officially closing the case. It also said Diane had submitted her resignation from the board effective immediately. He said the recall petition had gathered enough signatures and rather than face a vote, she had stepped down. He said the board appreciated my patience and that they were committed to improving transparency and communication. I replied with one sentence, "Thank you." Then I forwarded the email to my attorney, my contractor, and Ben. Luis replied first. He said, "Congratulations, do you still want the gate installed?" I said yes. He said, "I will be there Monday." Ben replied second. He said we should celebrate. "Do you drink beer?" I said yes. He said I will bring a 6-pack. My attorney replied last. She said, "Well done. This is a good outcome. Let me know if anything else comes up." I said I hope nothing does. She said with HOAs, something always does. The following week, the board held a special meeting to address the compliance backlog. Sandra was elected interim board president. Paul became treasurer. A third homeowner, a retired teacher named Ellen, joined as secretary. The new property manager attended and presented a revised enforcement process that required written notice, a 5-day response window, and a hearing before any fine over $25. The membership voted to adopt it unanimously. Diane did not attend. I heard from Ben that she had listed her house for sale. He said she told a neighbor that the association had become hostile and unmanageable. I said that is ironic. He said, "It is perfect." Luis finished the fence the following Monday. He installed a gate on the side yard and added a latch that locked from the inside. He said this should keep anyone from wandering into your yard uninvited. I said that is the idea. He said, "If you have any more trouble, call me. I know a lawyer who specializes in HOA cases." I said I already have one, but thank you. He said, "Good. You are going to need her." I said I hope not. He said, "You live in an HOA. You are going to need her." The fence stood. The refinance closed. The lien never appeared. I got a letter from the state a month later saying the investigation had concluded and that the HOA had been found in violation of procedural requirements, but that corrective measures had been implemented. The letter said the case was closed. I filed it in a folder labeled HOA, which now contained 63 pages of emails, notices, surveys, complaints, and settlement documents. I hoped I would never need it again. I knew I probably would. Ben and I became friends. We started a neighborhood group chat for homeowners who were tired of surprise enforcement actions and phantom rules. Within 2 weeks, 20 people had joined. Within a month, we had 40. Sandra attended one of our informal meetings and said the new board wanted input on revising the covenants. We said we had input. She said, "Good. Send it over." We did. 3 months later, the membership voted to adopt a revised covenant that eliminated the supplemental handbook, required all rules to be voted on and recorded, and created an appeals process for fines. Diane did not vote. Her house sold in June. The new owners introduced themselves at a neighborhood barbecue. They said they loved the fence, I said thank you. They said we heard you had some trouble with the old board. I said a little. They said we are glad that is over. I said so am I. A year later, I installed a deck. I submitted the application in advance, included the survey and the materials list, and waited for a response. The new property manager approved it in 4 days. No supplemental forms, no phantom easements, no megaphone. I hired Luis. He finished the job in 2 weeks. Nobody showed up to yell at me. Nobody threatened to tow anything. The HOA sent a courtesy inspection notice. A manager walked the property, took 3 photos, and emailed me a clearance letter the same day. I forwarded the letter to my attorney with a note that said it is possible. She replied, it is possible if you fight for it. I said I did. She said I know. That is why it worked. The fence is still there. The gate still locks. The survey stakes are long gone, but I kept the survey in a drawer just in case. I see the new board members at neighborhood events and we talk like neighbors, not adversaries. Diane is gone. The Hillcrest Reserve Association is quieter now, less like a surveillance state and more like a place where people live. I still check my mail every day for violation notices. I still record conversations when someone from the HOA shows up unannounced. Old habits die hard. But the fence stands, and the yard is mine, and nobody is threatening to tear it down. That is enough. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.